1969. Washington, D.C. had been Marvin Gaye's hometown, though he had not lived there in years. His younger brother, Frankie, had grown up in the same household, the same Pentecostal household run by the same strict father, had heard the same music and absorbed the same lessons about what the world required. And in 1969, Frankie Gaye was in Vietnam. The letters he sent home were not the letters that people sent from pleasant places. Vietnam in 1969 was not a pleasant place. It was a country in which young American men were dying at a rate that the news reported with a consistency that had made the dying feel, to the people receiving those numbers from their televisions, almost ordinary, almost a fact of the background rather than a catastrophe in the foreground. But the letters from inside the catastrophe did not have this quality of ordinariness. The letters described specific things, specific sounds, specific smells, specific moments in which the reality of what was happening could not be processed through any category that civilian life had prepared a person to use. Marvin received these letters and read them. He was living in Detroit, at the center of the Motown machinery, at the height of the commercial success that the duet recordings with Tammy Terrell and the earlier hits had produced. He was at the stage in his career where the system was working, where the records were selling, and the voice was in demand, and the professional machinery that Berry Gordy had built was producing, for Marvin Gaye, the results it was designed to produce. He was also a man who had recently lost Tammy Terrell, and who was beginning, in the specific way that people begin things before they fully know they have begun them, to understand that the music he was making was not the music he needed to make. And then a letter arrived from Vietnam, and then another. And in those letters, his younger brother described what the world looked like from inside a war that the rest of the country was arguing about from a safe distance. What's Going On was not simply an album about Vietnam. It was an album about the country that was making Vietnam possible, about the distance between the values the country claimed to hold and the things it was actually doing, about the people who were being left behind by a system that promised more than it delivered, about the specific quality of a time when a lot of things that had been held together were coming apart. Vietnam was the most visible of these things, but it was not the only one. Marvin built the album the way a person builds something when they are building it from materials that have accumulated over years. The letters from Frankie, the images from Berkeley that Ronaldo Benson had carried to him, the grief of Tammy Terrell's death, the specific spiritual and religious formation of his childhood that had given him a framework for thinking about suffering that was not simply political. He brought all of it into the studio and built something that was unified enough to be called an album and honest enough to carry the weight of what it was carrying. The production he created, the layered arrangements, the way the songs moved into each other without hard stops, the voices that were not studio professionals but actual people who had been at an actual party that Marvin had brought into the recording as the opening of the album, was not a commercial production in the Motown sense. It was the production of a person who has decided that the music needs to sound like life rather than like the commercial version of life. Berry Gordy heard it and heard what it wasn't. Marvin heard it and heard what it was. The distance between those two positions was the distance between what Frankie's letters had put inside Marvin and what the commercial machinery of Motown was equipped to receive. Frankie Gaye came home from Vietnam. He came home changed, in the ways that people come home from wars changed. The letters had described things that could not be undescribed, had asked a question that could not be unasked. Marvin had heard the question and had built a record around it. And the record, when it finally came out, carried the question to 40 million people who had not received a letter from Vietnam, but who recognized, when they heard the music, that the question was one they had been living inside without knowing how to name it. The United States had been in Vietnam since the early 1960s. By 1969, with the troop levels at their highest point and the public opposition to the war at a volume that the country's political and cultural institutions could no longer manage through ordinary channels, the war had become the defining context of American life in a way that could not be avoided, even by people who tried to avoid it. Marvin Gaye had not been in a position to avoid it. Frankie was there, and the specific, personal reality of having a younger brother inside the thing that the country was arguing about in abstract terms, a brother who was writing home to describe not the argument, but the thing itself, gave Marvin a relationship to the war that was different from the relationship most Americans had through their televisions. The letters described things that the television did not show. The texture of days inside a conflict that was not organized into the clean narrative shape that news coverage requires. The specific quality of fear that accumulates in a person who does not know whether the next day is going to be different from this one in ways they cannot prepare for. The loneliness of being far from home in conditions that make the ordinary things you miss, particular food, particular sounds, particular faces, feel impossibly remote. Marvin read the letters and could not stop reading them. Not because they were well written. Frankie was not writing literature. He was writing the way a young man writes when he needs his family to understand what is happening to him. But because the things they described were true, and the truth of them was a kind of demand. A demand that someone who was not there, who was safe in Detroit making commercial music for a successful record label, account for the distance between where he was and where his brother was. Ronaldo Benson of the Four Tops had brought Marvin a melody around the same time, the residue of a demonstration in Berkeley that Benson had witnessed, the specific image of people being beaten while the country argued about whether they should be. The melody and the sentiment matched what was in Frankie's letters with a precision that Marvin recognized immediately. Two different sources, the same question. What's going on? What's Going On was released on May 21, 1971. Frankie Gaye had been home from Vietnam for some time by then. The question the album asked, the question that had arrived in a letter from Southeast Asia, and that Marvin had carried into a studio and built a record around, was now a question being asked by millions of people on American radio. Frankie Gaye heard his brother's voice asking the question, and understood that something of what he had written, of what he had lived through and described in letters that were meant only for family, had found its way into music that was carrying the same weight far beyond the kitchen table where Marvin had first received it. This is what great music sometimes does with the private things that are given to it. The letters were private, one brother writing to another, the ordinary private language of family, trying to stay connected across an impossible distance. The music that was built from them was not private. It was on the radio, and on the record player, and in the living rooms of people who had no direct connection to Frankie Gaye or Marvin Gaye, or the specific Detroit household where the letters had arrived. But what those people felt when they heard the music was not distant from what Frankie had felt when he wrote the letters. The honesty traveled. The question traveled. The specific quality of a person in the middle of something terrible, trying to make sense of what they are seeing, that traveled too. A letter arrived from Vietnam in 1969. Marvin Gaye read it and could not put it down. He carried it into a studio and built a record that asked the question the letter was asking. The record has been playing for more than 50 years. The question has not been answered, but it has been asked again and again by people who have never heard of Frankie Gaye, but who recognize the moment they hear the music that the question is theirs too.